Hey, we meet again. I'm back with a brand new invention. Something grabs a hold of me tightly, flows like a harpoon daily and nightly. Will it ever stop? Yo, I don't know. Turn off the lights and I'll glow. To the extreme, I walk the mic like a vandal. Out the stage, like a chump, like a candle. Dance. That's funny and you know it. But what's even funnier is you're probably going ahead with the song. So anyway, I'm back with another short story. This one titled Breaking and Entering, which will also appear in the collection Dark Days, Darker Nights, which I hope to have out by the fall of 2014. But before I read this thing, I guess I need to send out a disclaimer for those of you who feel inclined to gather the family together for story time. And you know who you are. Justice. Warning. Warning. My stories are not, N-O-T, not, for those ears and eyes under 13. Although if you're one of those religious nuts, then perhaps no age is appropriate for my stories. But anywho, Breaking and Entering is a pretty nifty tale. Especially for those of you who absolutely, positively hate a thief, like most of us do. I had a friend read this thing several years ago when I first wrote it, and when he gave it back to me, he said, "Remind me to never break into your house." And I said, "Oh yeah." Well, as you can see, I got my guardian angel with me. And I'm sitting in a different location in my house. And as you probably noticed, there's a drawing of Hitler right here. I drew that a couple years ago. I hope it doesn't detract from the story. So, yeah. And before I forget, I want each and every one of you to pick up a copy of my novel, The Religion, by Viktor Wolfe. Victor with a K. You won't read another book like it for the rest of your life, I promise you. You can buy it at Amazon.com. Remember this? Oopa Gangnam Style. And who knows, it'd be so good you might even read it twice. And as a shout out to my dude Brandon Brennan, I'm going to start including religious quotes at the end of these little monologues. These precious gems can be found on most church signs all across America. Why would I do such a thing, you might ask? Because we absolutely love them. Some are pretty corny, but some, my God, some are downright awesome. Like today's quote, "If you put God first, you'll never be last." Bam! So, are we ready to get down and dirty with some breaking and entering? Well, let's have at it. Page 1. The time was just past midnight, and severe annoyance coursed through Freddie Tolliver's heart, heavily anticipating system as he sat 15 feet up in a tree, studiously watching the front of the Holman residence. He had been watching this house for the past several nights, casing it, trying to determine the perfect time in which to enter its precious domain and steal its many rumored treasures. As part of the rumor, he had heard there was a secret room where all this bounty was located. Valuable items such as autographed magazines and sports apparel, things owned by A-listers bought off of eBay and other online shop centers. Supposedly there was memorabilia from the last 3 wars and rare items bought from these geographical locations. Rare baseball cards, rare coins, and the like. And perhaps the most prized possession in the entire house was an original drawing drawn by none other than Adolf Hitler himself back during his poverty days as a young man in Vienna. Freddie couldn't wait to get his hands on that. If successful, then he was going to take his fortune westward, maybe even sell them at Pawn Stars in Vegas. That should be fun. Then he planned to head to the coast and live out the rest of his life, looking at the Pacific. Maybe even find a bride. That would be so nice. Wow. Living on the Pacific had been a dream of his for quite a while now, but he never had the means to get there. He lived paycheck to paycheck like most Americans stuck in mundane lives. But one night, One of his buddies taught him the art of breaking into houses. That friend is now in prison for getting involved in other things he had no business being involved in. But anyhow, Freddie learned a lot from him. Rule number 1, never break into an occupied house. Too many things could happen in the presence of a homeowner. Going through people's things while they were home was sloppy thievery. He simply refused to work under those tense circumstances. Rule number 2, never carry a gun. Too many things could go wrong with that scenario as well. He was only after a few extra bucks. He didn't need to be caught up in a gunfight, possibly spending the rest of his days with his friend in prison. Life behind bars would put a serious damper on the life he envisioned for himself in the Pacific. The two just didn't go together. Freddie hated a thief just as much as the next guy, but the business was kind of lucrative. He constantly told himself that once he got to the Pacific, he would abandon all traces of that less than honest lifestyle. At least I hope I will. That kind of thing was never promising. As he sat in the high fork of the tree, looking at the front of Glenn Holman's house, he suddenly heard a door slam, and then came the distinct sound of two people chattering. Was it finally his lucky day? Was he finally going to get to look around the Holman abode? To say the least, Freddie was excited. He gazed through his binoculars and watched Mr. Holman and Mrs. Holman emerge from the home. Mr. Holman graciously opened Mrs. Holman's car door for her. It appeared that they were still deeply in love. Who said chivalry was dead? Glenn Holman was nearing 50 years old. He had a decent-sized belly on him, and he was balding, right at the point where he should do like every other balding man in the country and shave his head. The other attribute that Mr. Holman possessed, the one Freddie enjoyed most, was that he was rich. Not superstar rich, but well on his way. He ran his own financial advising firm, owned the local newspaper, and had a hand in ensuring that his hand-picked politicians remained in office. What more can a thief want from his target? Mr. Holman whisked around the side of his black Mercedes, then dropped down into the driver's seat. Soon it rolled backward down the driveway, then rushed toward the far end of the street. And just like that, the Holman house was deserted. Freddie couldn't imagine where the Holmans could be going at this time of night. It seemed too good to be true. That sounded like another rule in the making. Rule number 3. If things were too good to be true, then they probably are. That wasn't a rule for breaking into houses. That was a rule for life in general. Despite it all, Freddie was curious as to where they were going. Maybe Glenn was attending a late-night political meeting. After all, Election Day was less than 2 weeks away. But why would Mrs. Holman accompany him? Did she like to dabble in politics too? Who knew? She might be one of those wives who liked to participate, or at least show an interest in what her husband was into. If that was the case, then poor Mr. Holman had more to worry about than the items Freddie planned to take this evening. Just as a precaution, Freddie always allotted his victims about 10 minutes after leaving their houses, just in case they pulled back into the driveway unexpectedly. A forgotten wallet, a credit card, receipt, what have you. Sometimes it was the longest 10 minutes of the night. Deeming it safe, Freddie threw the strap of his duffel bag around his neck, then climbed down the tree, exhilaration thriving inside him. He quickly treaded lightly across the street and up the side of the Holman's lawn, which had already started to dew up. He reached the back deck, then tiptoed to the back door. The technique he always tried first was the credit card method, or what he commonly referred to as CCM. If the victims weren't planning to be gone long, they usually never bothered with securing the deadbolt of the back door. Big mistake. Freddie withdrew Charles Brighton's MasterCard. He found it on the ground next to a gas pump last week. Luckily for Freddie, he was able to order $1,000 worth of stuff from the internet before the card was declined. And just before he was about to jab it into the door jamb, he discovered that the back door was standing ajar. And sometimes the owners forgot to lock the door altogether. That sinister thought surfaced to it in his mind again. Too good to be true. People who left the door ajar usually didn't have anything to steal in the first place. He was either that or someone who was just careless when passing through, like a kid or something. Though the occurrence heightened his senses, Freddie was pretty sure no one else was at the house. But he knew pretty sure didn't win strategic wars. Then I'm absolutely positive. Positive thinking always worked wonders. Very cautiously, he helped the door open just enough for him to slip through. The door didn't even squeak. He stepped through the threshold, his eyes wide and alert. There was always an overwhelming sense of disquietude that settled over his nerves whenever he first set foot into a new house. In the back of his mind, there was always the constant worry of how many nosy neighbors were secretly watching him, or how many dogs would come charging at him from around the corner, raising all kinds of cane. He hadn't noticed any kind of animal living at the premises, but that didn't mean one wasn't around. Truth be told, Freddie hated stealing from people. He knew most of them worked hard for the things they had, but the grandiose life of stealing was rather easy, and the benefits were actually amazing, considering the alternative. 40 hours a week of manual labor at minimum wage. Thanks, but no thanks. He looked up, catching sight of a giant chandelier hanging directly over his head. Sometimes he envisioned scenes from Home Alone. Any second now, that chandelier is going to fall on top of me, and I'll catch a glimpse of a small boy running through the house, laughing his ass off. Slowly and quietly, he ventured into the depths of the home. He took out a small penlight that glowed red, searching for a set of eyes glowing in the gloom. The outside light shined dimly through the windows, which, coupled with his red light, was just enough illumination to allow Freddie to complete his first order of business, to do a quick body and animal search. Once he deemed that the house was empty, he promptly got to work. He was greatly disappointed that he couldn't find the fabled trophy room. Either it was truly a rumor that it existed, or it was well hidden. No matter, there were still plenty of other things to snatch. He zipped his flashlight across the room that was apparently an office. He stepped inside, snatching the laptop on the desk and stuffing it into his bag. He gazed up at the shelf behind the desk. On it was a picture of Stephen King. He was instantly drawn to the picture. Freddie loved the King, who incidentally was actually part of his daydreams about the Pacific Ocean. Oftentimes he envisioned himself gazing upon the ocean, relaxing in his favorite chair and reading his favorite King novels. That, my friend, is what the paradise is all about. Upon closer inspection, he saw that it was even autographed. There was no way he could not take it. To Glenn, Freddie whispered, reading the inscription. Best wishes, Stephen King. Well, I'll be a motherfucker, Freddie said under his breath. When did that cocksucker ever meet the King? Just then, a floorboard cracked somewhere out in the hallway. Freddie whirled around, clicking off the flashlight, his heart beating frantically. He quickly tiptoed across the room and poked his head out into the dark passageway. He waited a few seconds, but he couldn't see or hear anything. He shook off the noise as paranoia, clicked his flashlight back on, and returned to the picture that was going to look so nice up on his own shelf. Who cares if it says Glenn, right? It'll be a nice reminder. He reached for the picture and suddenly heard a rustling sound behind him. Thinking that his mind was playing tricks on him again, he turned around just to amuse himself. But when he did, he saw an enormous man lunge at him with an object glinting red from the light of his flashlight. Before Freddie could react, the large man's arm was swinging downward. Freddie could only watch listlessly as the object came at him. He felt an enormous blast on the bridge of his nose and fell. There was a massive stinging sensation, but that was quickly replaced with darkness. Freddie Tolliver opened his eyes, but shut them instantly after feeling the tremendous pounding force between them. Pain throbbed sinfully. He blinked. The space he found himself was dark, but there was a small flickering fire not far from him. He moved to focus on it fully, but his body was constrained. He quickly realized he was tied up, and so tightly that he couldn't even bend his arms or legs. He was on his stomach, and his arms were secured down on his sides. He tried to roll over onto his back, but he couldn't muster the strength to get there. There was a heavy, deep snorting sound, and then the sound of spitting. Freddie's memory failed him at first, but then it suddenly came crashing back. A madman had come after him, holding an object. Yes, but what kind? A bat? Yes, that seemed right. He could remember his red light flashing off its smooth metal. Was it blood? "Wake your ass up, son," said a cold, hard voice from somewhere within the shadows, the spot where the snorting had come from. "What's happened to me?" Freddie asked, craning his neck, searching the darkness for a face to match the voice. "Why am I tied up?" From the shadows emerged a giant, hefty man whose face was twisted into a mask of menace. It had a black mustache that curled around a thin mouth and hung just off a square chin. The man's eyebrows were like two thick, black, bushy caterpillars that almost touched in the center. The man was none other than Glenn Holman. But that wasn't possible, was it? Freddie saw him leave, and he would have heard him if he came back. "You're where you should be," said Holman. "Please, Mr. Holman, let me go. I'm sorry you found me in your house. I truly am." There was no shame in admitting that he was starting to panic a bit. Glenn gazed down at him, his face solemn and orange from the flickering fire. "I'm sorry, kid," he said, "but I think it's a tad bit late for that shit, don't you think?" He fell into a fit of laughter, rocking backward, his right hand slapping at his knee. When it ended, he pointed his stubby finger at him and said, "Now I finally got you right where I want you, you little bastard." A new kind of fear gripped Freddie just then. What was Holman talking about exactly? What did he plan to do? "You called the police on me, didn't you?" he said, trying to feign the feeling of shame. The truth was, Freddie had been sent to jail more times than he cared to remember. Adding one more to that total wouldn't exactly hurt his feelings any. Holman bent, putting his face next to Freddie's. "In case you're wondering about the ropes, I'm just holding you captive until them useless police do get here. This way you can't run." He snuffed snot, then hawked it toward the fire. "I hate the thought of you getting away without learning your lesson." Freddie nodded emphatically. "Yes, Mr. Holman, I surely have. After this, I won't ever do anything this stupid again." Holman slapped the side of Freddie's head so hard that he thought he had cracked him with a piece of steel. "Why don't you just shut the fuck up right now?" Holman bellowed. "And don't you give me that horse shit. You ain't learned no damn lesson yet. How could you? Fuck." There was nothing Freddie could say. Sure, he had been caught. Sure, he had slipped up somewhere. But where? Amid the raw pain on the side of his head, he retraced his steps. There simply were no mistakes. He had even watched Mr. Holman leave with his wife. "I saw you leave with your wife," he said. Glenn shook his head. "That wasn't me, you moron. That was my dumbass cousin." He smiled as if reminiscing on his past. "Most of the family thinks my dad fucked my mom's sister." He chuckled, waving his hand. "That is neither here nor there. But this dumbass cousin of mine," he trailed off, shaking his finger. "I know he's fucking my wife." He shrugged. "Oh well," he said, casting his eyes to Freddie. "It doesn't much matter anymore. By the way, have you seen my wife? I mean, really seen her?" He shuddered. "She's gotten kind of plump over the years, but hey," he patted his own belly, "haven't we all?" Freddie couldn't wait for the police to arrive, hoping they were just outside. Now there's a thought a criminal doesn't have too often. He didn't particularly like hearing about Holman's problems. It seemed the more he heard, the more agitated Holman became, and then somehow he'd get all the blame. Crazy Holman might even take out his aggressions on him while he was tied up. All part of the plan. Freddie didn't like that one bit. He strained to hear an oncoming siren, but the night was still. Not even the crickets were chirping. Come to think of it, not even the fire was crackling. You do realize that he didn't call the police, don't you? No, Freddie didn't want to think that way. Negative thoughts only increased his paranoia, and Lord knows he didn't need that right at the moment. "The truth is," Holman continued, "I haven't fucked her in almost a year. Can you imagine it?" He shook his head as if shameful. He let out a long breath. "But I've been getting my pussy from this housewife that lives across town. She gives me what I need. You know what I mean?" He played with his ring, then looked at Freddie again. "I guess you don't really need to hear about my troubles, huh?" He gestured his hand toward him. "Especially when you got some pretty fucked up ones of your own, huh?" Freddie gulped but said nothing. He imagined he looked like a frightened, captured rabbit. "Well," said Holman, "I realized it was a shitty thing to do, but I had to get them out of here, so you, my friend, could come waltzing into my domain." He nodded. "Yep, that's right. I knew you were in that fucking tree out there just waiting for us to leave." He laughed to himself. "That's one reason I left the back door open. I sort of had an inner debate about that. I thought you'd see that and run for the hills." He laughed again. "Boy, was I wrong." He stood up and walked toward the fire. Going back over his mistakes, Freddie guessed that was probably the biggest one. But the temptation was just too great. He was literally sucked in. He should have bounced when his intuition told him to. "Where were you hiding?" he asked. "I went through the entire house." Holman chuckled. "This house holds a lot of secrets," he said, emerging from the darkness, carrying a long crowbar. He slapped it against his meaty palm slowly and methodically. Freddy didn't like the sound that crowbar made at all, nor did he care for the look in Holman's face. He struggled against the tightly bound ropes. "I can guarantee you one thing," said Holman, raising his eyebrows. "You won't be coming out of those knots. I was a boatswain's mate, 3rd class in the U.S. Navy. Trust me, those knots are forever." Feeling more and more helpless, Freddy did the only thing he left to do. He screamed. Holman erupted with hearty laughter. "Go ahead and scream, you sissy bitch! No one's going to hear you!" He screamed with him. "Ah!" Freddy clutched desperately onto the bleak hope that someone, a neighbor perhaps, would hear him. Holman laughed maniacally between his own wailing screams, all the while holding his protruding stomach. He abruptly quit and stared devilishly into Freddy's frightened face. "You illegally entered my house," he said somberly, "and now you're going to have to pay the piper." He lifted the steel bar high over his head. "No, no, no, please!" cried Freddy. "I'll do anything you want!" And in that split second, Freddy thought Holman would lower the bar and consider a certain number of sexual favors, because Holman seemed to be that very type. But it was not to be. The crowbar came down in a mighty arc, hitting Freddy's back with an audible thud. He cried out in a panicky horror, tears now coming to his eyes at the realization that he was going to have to endure several more of these wicked lashings. How far is this lunatic going to go with this? Freddy thought, as another soaring pain rippled through his body as the rod of black steel slammed against his ribs. Holman swung the crowbar over and over again. "Until you're dead," Freddy's subconscious answered, "or until one of these ribs cracks and punctures your lungs." Pain begat pain, and then there was a crunching sound somewhere on his left side. "Jesus, my rib." "I hope you like that, you thieving bitch asshole," Holman gritted. He dropped the crowbar on the floor, then knelt down, putting his face next to Freddy's tear-streaked cheeks. Freddy could barely bring himself to open his eyes. It was horrifying enough that he could feel the madman's breath on his face. He felt that at any second now he was going to vomit blood, and he hoped he would do it right in Holman's stinking mouth. "I got a surprise for you, you faggot," said Holman, standing up. Oh shit, he thought. Holman's sexual perversions were soon to present themselves. Calling him a faggot seemed to be a justification to carry them out. Holman scrounged around in his pocket. A second later, his hot breath returned to Freddy's face. He mumbled something, but Freddy couldn't make out what it was. He parted his eyes and saw Holman fidgeting with a pocket knife. Another wave of panic flooded through him. There was no telling what he planned to do with that. Oh Jesus, he's going to cut my dick off, oh shit. Tears came to Freddy's eyes as panic intensified. "Think I'm going to set you free, don't you?" said Holman, shaking his head. If only he knew how far that was from Freddy's mind. "Nope, think again," said Holman. "Whether you noticed it or not, you are tied up with a white rope, a red one, and a blue one. Sure is patriotic, ain't it?" He offered a dumb grin. "Where are the cops?" Freddy's swelled throat managed, praying they were on their way, and close, but still no sirens could be heard. Still hanging on to that tiny shred of hope, huh? Yes, because it was the only thing Freddy could cling to. "The white rope is securing your left arm," Holman explained, ignoring his captive's question. "The red one is securing your right arm, while the blue one is binding both your legs together." He bent over the white rope and began sawing at it with his knife. Freddy's mind was playing tricks on him now, because it seemed as if Mr. Holman was setting him free. "I'm losing my freaking mind." Once the white rope was loosened, Freddy was able to move his arm, but Holman quickly stomped on it, pinning it to the floor. "What the fuck do you think you're doing?" he asked bitterly. Freddy's mind suddenly went blank. Now it seemed blatantly obvious that Holman never intended to set him free, ever. He envisioned the police busting down the door with assault weapons drawn. Never in his wildest dreams would he ever think he'd request such a thing. But now was the time. Boy, was it ever. Holman positioned his knees on Freddy's forearm, his body blocking Freddy's view of his arm and hand. Then he felt a sharp point in the center of his open palm. "What are you doing?" Freddy exclaimed, trying to close his hand. "Just shut the fuck up!" There was a sound of metal hitting metal, and then the pain. Oh Lord, the pain. With a few more quick hits, Holman squealed laughter, then moved off of Freddy's arm, standing and pointing at what he had done. Freddy looked over and seen a long metal spike driven into the palm of his left hand. Dark red blood was already running onto the wooden floor. Electrical impulses shook his entire left side as he tried to move his hand. Shock had gripped his throat so tight that it prohibited him from screaming. Holman jumped up and down, laughing merrily, like a mentally challenged adult watching a magic show. It was at this precise moment that Freddy realized that Holman didn't intend to kill him. He intended to torture him before he died. "Why are you doing this?" Freddy mumbled, hardly able to breathe. Holman didn't answer. Instead, he jumped to the other side of Freddy and started sawing at the red rope. When it was loosened, Freddy had the presence of mind to quickly tuck the hand underneath his body, but he wasn't too sure what that would solve. Holman stood up with his crowbar. "Put your hand out," he instructed. Still absorbed in the tremendous pain of his cracked rib and the Jesus nail through his left hand, Freddy said, "Go fuck yourself." Holman chuckled, then began beating Freddy's back with the crowbar. Another rib cracked, probably the same one, just in another place. Finally, Freddy put his hand out, crying and spitting blood. Holman dropped his knees onto Freddy's right forearm, then grabbed a meat cleaver that he just so happened to have nearby. "Please, Mr. Holman," Freddy whispered, wondering how the words had physically come out. "Don't. I'm begging you." He never saw the meat cleaver. He assumed another spike was coming. With one quick movement, Holman struck the edge of the 8-inch blade onto Freddy's right wrist, severing it away from his body. There was an audible crunch, and then the blood rushed out like a backed-up sewer pipe, moving swiftly across the floor at a pretty good clip. The fingers of the severed hand wiggled spasmodically. Before Freddy could scream, the instantaneous pain made him bite his tongue in half. And then he screamed for the next 10 minutes, until his voice went hoarse and he couldn't breathe. "Now," Holman announced, I'd like to see you steal anything with that hand again." And then that incessant laugh. Freddy could not hear one word uttered from the maniac's mouth, for the flaring torture erupting from the end of his arm was supremely unbearable. "I suspect your other hand will heal," said Holman. "But let's do something fun anyhow." He stood on Freddy's upper left arm, then wrenched his hand over the nail head. With one quick pull, he worked Freddy's lower arm against his elbow joint, dislocating it and bending it completely backward until the bone protruded through the skin. Freddy's cries were silent but intense. Tears poured from his eyes. "Well, you probably won't be able to use that arm either," Holman said matter-of-factly. By this time, Freddy was numb. He was shaking and bleeding out. His teeth chattered. He was quite aware that this was the end. The human body can only take so much torture. He was more than ready to see the light at the end of the tunnel. He just prayed he would like what he saw at that end. His subconscious mind regarded the concept of the deathbed repentance. The powers that be were giving him this time to repent. He was just too numb to realize it at the beginning. But now it was obvious. This was his chance. Oddly enough, Holman was doing him a favor by not killing him all at once. Was this God's plan, he wondered? If so, then it is true what they say. God really does work in mysterious ways. "Dear God in heaven," he prayed, "thank you for giving me this opportunity to repent my sins to you, for they are plenty." While he prayed, his waning vision saw Holman perched over the fire, holding the crowbar over the flickering orange flames. He may have been singing, but there was no doubt that Holman was going to beat him again with it. Maybe even brand him with one of his stupid made-up symbols. But Freddy didn't care, not at this point. By that time, all that came to pass, he would have already asked the Lord for his forgiveness, and all would be taken care of. "All my life I have been a sinner," Freddy continued to pray. "But I'm asking you, dear Lord, that you come into my life now and save me. Allow me to walk with you in paradise. I want to forget about all this miserable life here on earth, and enjoy my new life with you." Freddy felt movement, and with it came more pain. He was being rolled onto his back. He parted his eyes, watching Holman position himself at his knees. Freddy's mind lulled. Now he's going to cut my legs off. He wants to make me some kind of quadriplegic. Although he assumed the preachers were right, that once he was saved, that no amount of torture was going to pry him away from God, he was still very queasy about the prospect of experiencing his legs or feet being cut off. "Take me now, Lord," Freddy said aloud. "I am ready." Holman shook his head. "The Lord can't save you from this." He probed the hot crowbar tip between Freddy's ass cheeks. Thinking he was numb from any sort of torturous pain, Holman decided to run onto him. He screamed at the burning of his flesh. "It's going to be a heck of a lot harder than this where you're going," said Holman, gritting his teeth. He sucked in a large breath, then rammed the piece of steel up Freddy's anal cavity as far as it would go, ripping, tearing, and singeing the flesh along the way. Hot blood poured out of his ass. He stiffened, his toes curling against the horrific agony. Finally, he threw up, blood coming out of both ends. Holman laughed hysterically, jumping to the front of Freddy's body, leaving the crowbar sticking haphazardly out of Jimmy's rectum. He knelt down, his face inches from Freddy's. "Do you want to know what I call this method of torture I've just bestowed upon you?" he asked, his eyes wide and straining wickedly. The only thing going through Freddy's mind at the moment was that he wanted to die, and right now, no other thought consumed him. "I call this magnificent treat breaking and entering." He burst into another fit of laughter. "Get it, huh? You get it?" He chomped his teeth, stood up, and went to the doorway. "I'll be right back, sweetheart. Now don't you go dying on me." He waved curtly at him. "Ta-ta!" As Freddy lay there bleeding to death, he thought about the things he came here to get. He thought about the autographed picture of Stephen King. There was nothing on this green earth that was worth what he had been through. Nothing. He seriously doubted he would wish this kind of treatment upon his worst enemy, which at the moment was Glenn Holman himself. Now he retracted that thought. He sure would like to witness someone ramming something large and long in Holman's ass. He couldn't help it. Eye for an eye. Within minutes, Holman came whistling back, rounding the corner of the room with an axe secured tightly in his grip. "I'm back," he proclaimed melodiously. He tilted his head, staring at Freddy. "Guess what I'm going to do now?" Freddy didn't want to dignify him with a response. "I'll give you a hint. It's something I read in a book somewhere. I remember thinking how cool it was. And then I wondered if I would ever get to do that someday." He knelt down with the axe, scrunching his face and showing all of his teeth. "Well, guess what? Today is that motherfucking day." Freddy was under the impression that Holman intended to cut him up in as many pieces as he could. He screamed weakly, the loss of blood taking its toll in his futile efforts to cry out for help. Holman spit on his hands. "There's little need to scream now," he said, raising the axe. Freddy closed his mind to reality and placed his precious thoughts on the Lord God and his wondrous streets of gold. But just as Holman drew in a deep breath, the blade of the axe almost touching the ceiling, the front door to the house swung open. "Oh my gracious, it's the police." "God damn it," Holman bleated, irritated. "Not now, Jesus." But before Holman could rush to meet whoever came through the door, his wife rounded the corner, her eyes fixing on the devilish sight before her. She gasped, holding her hand over her chest. "Glenn," she barked, "what the hell is going on in here?" "Claudia," he said, trying to block her line of sight. "What on earth are you doing back so soon?" "I thought I told you to stay gone for a while." He craned his neck past her, his eyes searching. "And where is that damn cousin of mine?" "There ain't nowhere to go this time of night except the damn bars," she said. "And you know how much I despise the bars around this stupid town." She kept trying to look past Holman. "Who is that on the floor in there?" "That's the son of a bitch who's been terrorizing our neighborhood," said Holman. "I finally got him." Claudia shouldered past her husband, stepping into the room, but Holman held her back. "Don't go any further, Claudia. You don't want to get blood all over your shoes because then you'll track it everywhere in the house. And we don't need that shit." As if that was her only worry. "Have you called the police?" she asked. Holman nodded. "Yep. They should be here any minute now." "How did all the blood come about?" Claudia asked, her eyes scanning over the entire room. She flipped the light switch, but the lights didn't come on. Annoyance grew in Holman's face. "You know, you ask an awful lot of questions." Freddy's eyes squeezed out more tears because perhaps this horrible nightmare would soon be coming to a close. Before he knew it, he'd be in a hospital room, and Claudia Holman would be credited for saving his life. But then he asked himself if he wanted to be saved. How would life play out, considering his extensive injuries and downright mutilations? He cringed at the thought. He would be filled with so much hate that a life serving the Lord would prove unbearable. And then he would resent the big guy in the sky for allowing him to live in such misery. So what kind of salvation would that be? "Kill me," Freddie groaned to Glenn. Please. I don't want to be saved now. I want to die. I need to die. Just go lay down for a little while, Holman said to Claudia, and I'll get all this taken care of. He patted her shoulders. Trust me. Claudia nodded, but when she turned her back on him, he picked up the axe and charged after her with it. The blade buried itself in the top of her skull. She collapsed as if her legs were made of wet spaghetti noodles. Holman wrenched the blade from the back of her head, then licked the blood from it. He walked over to Freddie, then shivered with glee. Man, I've been wanting to do that fucking shit for the past 10 years now. Wow. I can't believe she's finally dead. Jesus H. Christ. The bitch is dead. He smiled as if remembering a happy moment in his life. Hail to Glenn Holman, Holman announced, bowing with his axe. The fucking bitch is dead. He laughed hysterically, but then he instantly calmed himself as if by a switch, reflecting. But I've got a little problem now. I have to dispose of her damn body, which is not going to be easy. What with police coming around here asking questions, looking around, insurance policy, the whole complete fucking mess. He sat down, disturbed by the work that lay ahead. What about this smile on my face? He asked, no one in particular. How am I going to hide that? He shook his head. Jesus. A simple guy like me can't be fucking happy for one goddamn minute without a lot of shit-ass consequences. He looked toward Freddie. This world is not a good place, my friend. Freddie found a small voice. Please kill me, he breathed. Holman stood over Freddie, debating with himself. Well, I sure would like to see you make it, kid. I really would, because I believe you truly learned your lesson, haven't you? Freddie did not respond. But allowing you to live would be pure stupidity on my part. I'm already sort of fucked trying to cover up my wife's murder. I don't need you out in the world alive and fucking up my shit. You can surely see my dilemma, can't you? Freddie wasn't going to argue with him. He spat blood, laboring for breath. It was truly failing him now. He had lost so much blood. The firelight was growing dimmer. I think I've had my fun with you, said Holman, but now I've got to get to work. He smiled, then lifted the axe high over his head, Claudia's blood dripping from the blade. A half-second later, it whistled through the air in a gray-red blur. But Freddie Tolliver was already dead, even after the axe split his face in two. Nestled into the dark corner of his house, holding a blood-stained axe in his blood-stained hands, looking out into the looming darkness, was Mr. Glenn Holman, waiting for his next victim to come creeping into his house. He hoped to God it was his cousin. The first thing he was going to do. The end.